These are notes, or U.S. History Notes 3.6, the conclusion of World War II. So we're now looking at the very end in both the European theater and the Pacific theater. And we'll start in Europe, in the European theater, and kind of look first at just a review of what we already know and what was happening. So the Allied plan in Europe was to basically close in on Berlin. So we had the U.S., Great Britain, and France coming in from the west through France. Remember the D-Day invasion and going through France to go towards Germany and Berlin. We had the Russians coming from the east and Russia going towards Germany and Berlin. And then we also had the U.S. and Great Britain coming up through North Africa, up through Italy, and pushing from the south up towards Germany and Berlin. So the goal was to basically push the Germans not just back to Germany, but also into Berlin, take it over. Once the city fell, their capital fell, their government fell, we would win the war. So eventually, with his plan actually working, Hitler realizes that he is going to lose the war. Hitler does not want to be put on trial for his crimes. He doesn't want to have to answer for what he's done. He has seen what happened to Mussolini in Italy, and he doesn't want people to have access to his body. So he actually commits suicide and has one of his subordinates destroy his body. So on April 30th, 1945, Hitler commits suicide, and just a few days later, Germany surrenders. So May 8th, 1945, Germany has surrendered, and we celebrate this as VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day. So the Allies have won in Europe, it's celebrated, there are parades, people are so happy, the war is over, or at least the war in Europe is over. And we end up, like I said, we celebrate, we're very happy, and all of the things that were agreed to at the Yalta Conference, which happened prior to the end of the war, are now going to be put in place. So the Yalta Conference happened shortly before the end of the war. It happened in 1945, and FDR was a part of this, and it kind of made some agreements on what should happen after the war in Europe was won. So in February, FDR, Churchill, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Stalin, the Premier of Russia, got together at Yalta and made some agreements. They knew they were winning at this point. So they were closing in on Berlin. They knew they were going to win. And so they sat down to make some agreements, to make a plan for what the world would look like. And so this really worked because FDR was respected by Stalin. Stalin didn't respect a lot of people, but FDR he did respect. So he was willing to work with them, and they made these agreements, many of them between the U.S. and Soviet Union. So there are essentially 4 things that are agreed to at Yalta by the Big Three. That's what they're called during this time. So the Big Three, FDR, Stalin, and Churchill. First, the Soviet Union agrees that once the war in Europe is over, they will then shift their troops to Asia and help the U.S. defeat Japan in Asia. Second, they talk about Poland and decide that Poland will become independent and get to create their own government after this. Third, they make the Declaration of a Liberated Europe, which says that all these countries that had been taken over by Germany and had been forced to be under German Nazi regimes would now get to create their own governments. So the Soviet Union would help them because they were all Eastern European countries that the Soviet Union had liberated, so they could help them, but these countries would be free and independent. And finally, the last piece was about Germany. The agreement about Germany was that the big 4 countries, the U.S., the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France, would actually divide Germany up. So each part of one of the major allies would get a section of Germany that they would then control and be in charge of. So we actually had 4 different pieces of Germany, 4 zones. They would also split Berlin into 4 zones in the same way. And you can see in the map how that kind of worked with Germany, and then with Berlin, we did the same essential thing. And Germany was also, at the Soviet Union's insistence, required to pay some reparations for the war. However, it was only if they could pay. It was all based on if they could pay. So we weren't trying to punish Germany in quite the same way, trying to make sure the people of Germany were still taken care of, even though there were some problems between the countries, and we were still angry at Germany. We didn't want to set it up so they would have another war and a reason for people to support another war. So the war in Europe is over, but the war in the Pacific was still happening. So the war in Europe ended in May of 1945, but the Japanese were not going to give up. So they were going to continue to fight until the death, and they were not looking anywhere near being ready to give up. So the U.S. realized they needed to do something different. So if we kind of review where we were at and what was happening there, the U.S. had used island hopping to get from the U.S. close to Japan and the main islands of Japan. So we can see in the map how we kind of did that. We had talked about that in class. So we had worked our way across. So we had supply lines, we had bases, and we also have kind of launching points for attacks on Japan, on the Japanese military. So we had worked our way across the Pacific this way. Even though Japan's allies had all fallen and the U.S. was closing in on Japan itself, they were not willing to give up. The Japanese were willing to fight to the death, never surrender. The Soviet Union joined the war effort, so now we have the U.S., the Soviet Union, and China still fighting. And Japan just refuses to give up. And so President Truman has to make a decision. What can he do to end this war, save American lives, save money? The atomic bomb. That's the decision. See, even the dog gets worked up at the mention of the atomic bomb. Truman decides, we have the atomic bomb, we developed it through the Manhattan Project, let's use it to end the war in the Pacific. And when he kind of balances costs and benefits, he sees the benefits of using the bomb as less than the costs of using the bomb. So after much discussion with his advisors, President Truman makes the decision to drop the atomic bomb. Actually drops 2 atomic bombs, the first on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, the second on Nagasaki 3 days later, August 9th, 1945. So we actually do drop 2 atomic bombs. And here you see the Enola Gay, the plane that dropped the first bomb. There's what the bombs looked like. They called them the Fat Man and Little Boy. And then you have a picture of Hiroshima after the dropping of the bomb. So we said we had these weapons, but they didn't necessarily believe us until they saw what kind of destruction these weapons really were capable of. So we did the first, and then the Japanese were kind of stunned, but still didn't immediately surrender. So Truman sent another bomb. And the reason it's President Truman, not FDR, is because FDR had died in April of that year. So he actually did not see the end of World War II in Europe or in the Pacific. So Truman made the decision early in his presidency to drop the atomic bomb. But after dropping the second atomic bomb, Japan does surrender to the U.S. And so on August 15th, 1945, the World War II officially ends in the Pacific, which means World War II is over for everyone, and that is VJ Day, so Victory Over Japan Day. And you probably have seen this picture before, one of the most famous pictures, celebrating the end of World War II. And again, huge celebrations, parades. People were so happy that the war was finally over and that these brutal dictators had been stopped from harming all of the people that they were harming and taking over the rest of the world. So then we had to come up with a peace agreement in Asia. And this really is between the U.S., the Soviet Union, and China, with the U.S. and Soviet Union really making the decisions. So first, the 2 countries agreed to give China back all of its taken territory. So that was the very first thing they did. Then they based some things off the Yalta Conference, some of the decisions they made in Europe with splitting Germany and splitting Berlin. And we actually agreed to split some of the territory that Japan had taken over. And 2 of the major territories that Japan had taken over that the U.S. and Soviet Union agreed to split between the 2 of them were French Indochina, which today we know as Vietnam, and Korea. So we took both of those and we actually split them essentially in half. Vietnam we split at the 17th parallel, and so you can see it there on the right. It's actually from 1954, but still gives you the idea. And Korea we split at the 38th parallel, and you can see it on the left. And the U.S. actually controlled the southern portions of both countries, and the Soviet Union controlled the northern portions. So we each were able to put in our own governments and determine what we wanted those countries to look like and make them essentially allies of our countries based on what we wanted them to be and have. So as you can imagine, the Soviet Union put in communist-friendly governments in those places, and the U.S. put in democratic governments. Now, this is going to become important later after all of the peace agreements are signed, but we need to set the stage for some of our later problems with the Soviet Union because of some of the things that happened in World War II. Another piece that goes along with this is we actually create the United Nations. Now, the United Nations was something that FDR had been supporting since 1944. He had come up with this idea. He pushed it at Yalta, and really it was one of the parts of Yalta, the Yalta Conference as well, was to create this United Nations where every country can come together and discuss and plan what to do when there are conflicts. So the United Nations, like I said, every country gets one vote, every country is involved. Every country in the world that is recognized as a country, that their government is recognized, actually has a seat in the United Nations to help make this decision. And they met in different places in the country previously, but today they actually have a permanent home in New York City. So all of the countries have representatives there. But it's set up as a general assembly where every country has input and every country has one vote. Then we have this group called the Security Council, and there are 11 members of the Security Council. And they basically get to sit down in the center of the meeting, so this is actually where they meet today. But they get to sit there, and the 11 members of the Security Council all actually have, they make the decisions with the input of the others. There are 5 permanent members, so 6 of them are voted on at a regular basis, but there are 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and there you can see down in the center, the Security Council. Those 5 permanent members were decided on at Yalta. And as you could probably guess, those 5 permanent members are the 5 major Allied powers from World War II: the U.S., Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and China. And this is actually going to create some problems as well because we have some very different views about what the world should look like in those 5 countries. Any one of those 5 countries, however, can veto what the whole group decides. So everybody else in the UN could say one thing. If one of those countries says no, the United Nations does not do it. They have veto power. So this group, which was designed to ensure world peace and keep peace within the world, find peaceful solutions to problems between countries, is officially created on April 25th of 1945. And like I said, the charter is created, the United Nations goes into place, and so post-World War II, the United Nations is there to try to solve problems that are created in the world. Now, one of the things that they have to deal with, and that is dealt with very quickly, is putting not just Nazis, but also the Japanese on trial for war crimes. The big famous trials about the war crimes are actually called the Nuremberg trials that started in August of 1945 in Nuremberg, Germany, and they were punishing Nazi leaders, Nazi doctors, people who really participated in the Holocaust and led the Holocaust. So not every soldier was put on trial for war crimes, but a lot of them were, and a lot of the leaders of those groups were. So these trials are actually run by the U.S., the Soviet Union, France, and Great Britain, the Nuremberg trials. They have former prisoners, survivors of the Holocaust, who come in and testify about the atrocities. They bring in evidence, graves that they found, pictures, all kinds of things that show these horrible things that happened in the Holocaust. And so these people, these Germans who participated in it, 36 of them are sentenced to death for their actions in the Holocaust. 114 of them get prison sentences. There are really none that are said, okay, you didn't really do anything wrong, you can go. So this is to punish those people and find a way to punish the people who are doing these unspeakable acts, things that we had never seen before. And so the Nuremberg trials are designed to do that, and it's a cooperation between multiple countries and it is a military court, so they don't have to follow the same procedures civilian courts do. And the Japanese are also put on trials. They're similar trials, they're just not in Nuremberg, Germany. And so in Tokyo, they have trials for Japanese war criminals who were responsible for some of the atrocities there against the Americans, the Chinese, the Australians, and they actually have 7 people sentenced to death there, and 18 are given prison sentences. So a lot of those people who were involved in, say, the Bataan Death March, there's testimony from people who survived that. Those are the kinds of crimes that they're looking at in Tokyo when they're looking at the Asian brutality. So the people who were extremely brutal in war are punished at the end of World War II. That doesn't make it better, that doesn't make it okay, but it does give you a feeling that justice was served once the war ended. So in 1945, the world is at peace. But these peace agreements from Yalta and from our agreements in the Pacific with the Soviet Union and China, they're not going to last. There are so many differences in beliefs between the US and the Soviet Union, and both being the major powers, we really end up creating a 30-year war that we call the Cold War. And so our next unit is about the Cold War, and really the results of World War II set up the Cold War and really show that it will happen. And our tension between the two countries being two major powers, that we proved that the two of us together could win a war, but we can't agree on anything after that. And so that's what we're going to look at after Christmas break.